Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Weakest Link, Identifying and Vanquishing Compliance Risks. Before we begin, let's go over a few housekeeping items. If you're on the line and have not yet connected to the webinar, click the link in your confirmation email. Your browser may prompt you to download and run a file. When you're connected, you should see the presentation on your screen. If you have questions, you can send them via Zoom's Q&A function. Please take a moment and find the chat bubble icon near the bottom and center of the webinar screen. You can type and send questions throughout the presentation. We'll compile them and take time at the end for answers. When the questions have been answered, we will be giving away a gift card. So stick around because we'll be randomly selecting someone from the list of people who are still connected to the webinar. Also, mark your calendars. Other presenters originally scheduled to speak at the Provider Education Summit will be doing webinars in the near future. The next one will be Soft Skills Are the New Hard Skills, and Here's Why. It's by Michael Page, and he will be speaking Thursday, May 7th at noon. You can register and see additional upcoming events at uhin.eventbrite.com. That is uhin.eventbrite.com. We will also be sending out advertisement email shortly. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy will be made available to all attendees after the event. Now it's time to begin. Robin, the time is all yours.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm happy to be here today. It's a little different than I think we had all anticipated originally, but I'm grateful to UHIN for making it possible for us to still get together and talk about these things, which sometimes seem daunting, but I'm hoping I can make them a little bit simpler. And we can get through all of this today together, a good time to connect, albeit remotely. So I am Robin Johns. I am the compliance officer with MedUSA. We are a Utah-based revenue cycle and practice management and software company. And I have worked in the healthcare billing and business side of things for a really long time, since college actually. And I have been doing compliance kind of since the beginning, it feels like. So hopefully some of that. My main focus is always trying to make sure that we are compliant in all that we do. We're following all the laws and regulations and operating at the highest ethical standards, but also making things practical because we all need to get work done. So hopefully as we go through this today, you'll get some of those messages as well. I appreciate those who have joined the meeting today because I know we all have a million things going on. I thought it would be good to kind of touch on why this is still extremely important during this time of COVID-19. So just a couple of statistics that we wanted to highlight. So in March, Bitdefender Labs detected 5 times more coronavirus-themed malware than they had. So of the malware that was out there, 5 times more of it was coronavirus themed. So hackers are taking advantage of our situations. They're not taking a break, as some of us may feel like we're doing by working remotely or anything like that. Also on March 23rd, the Office of Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services issued a COVID-19 fraud alert, making sure that wanting to make both providers and patients alert of hackers that were impersonating and still are impersonating people like the CDC, the WHO, NATO, all sorts of organizations because of our need, especially at that time, but as we continue going forward, for information. We all want to keep updated. We want to know what the latest is, especially as there's talk of opening things up a little bit. So they are taking advantage of that and impersonating websites or emails so that we will click on them. So there are many malicious websites out there that are claiming to track worldwide cases. Those interactive maps that we all like to click on are extremely dangerous, so it's good to be aware of that. And they also have a lot of phishing campaigns that are spoofing the remote programming that we are using to keep our offices running, like Zoom and Skype and all of those remote work platforms. So they are asking people, they're spoofing them, and then people are putting in their passwords. They're also asking people to verify personal information to try to get their stimulus checks, to do vaccines, or even information about different things. So just a reminder of why it's so important that we try to keep ourselves and each member of our staff up to date and make sure that our policies and procedures and everything that we have in place are still addressing these as we change quickly during this COVID-19 time. So just to kind of go over, let's kind of look at the landscape right now of compliance generally, and what are those risks that are that are coming against us all of the time. What's kind of the highest right now? So these are the topics that we'll go over today for the most part. The first one is data breaches. Then private litigation, which is increasing. We'll talk about what we can learn from HIPAA enforcement actions over the last year or two. What also we're seeing in their prosecutions of billing fraud and the types of things that they are highlighting, and then what is happening with some state and federal regulations that are coming out. So for data breaches, just again to get the lay of the land, in the Black Book Market Research Survey, they found that healthcare providers represented 4 out of 5 of the cybersecurity breaches that they identified, and that 2/3 of those healthcare organizations that participated had experienced a data breach. And this is largely because personal health information, or PHI, private health information and protected, is more valuable on the black market than credit card credentials or any other regularly personal identifiable information. They can get a lot more money for protected health information than for any other kind of information. So, and they have found that healthcare providers tend to be easier targets. At least they used to be. I think we're improving on that. But they have found that hospitals, even larger groups, sometimes are a little bit behind the times. We also have the risks that are being opened up as we start participating more increasingly in the Internet of Things, as more and more of our medical devices become Internet enabled and start sending information back and forth. That's also going to be part of the issue now as they have opened up the opportunities for telehealth. So these kinds of risks are just increasing. And it's important to recognize that the number of records that were breached tripled between 2017 and 2018, and then they have tripled again in 2019 to over 41.4 million records, or million patients and people basically, that were harmed through breaches. And that number for 2019 is actually probably underestimated at this point, because at the time, some of the breaches that had been reported had not actually reported the total numbers that had been affected. So we can see that this is something that is increasing, it's not going away. And it's also important for us to recognize that the average cost of a breach for a healthcare organization is $1.8 million. So as we talk about the different things we may want to put in place, and we look at, obviously we want to be practical and do things in a financially responsible way for our offices and our practices, but we want to understand what the risks are as well and the costs could be of a breach, and start to analyze those options with that in mind. Okay, so let's talk about data breaches. Just a few examples of the types of things that we're seeing in the last year or so. So starting about a year ago, at Brookside ENT, hackers deleted all the practice records after the owners refused to pay the ransom. So their records were encrypted through ransomware. As often is recommended, the owners did not pay the ransom, but they were unable to rebuild their records entirely, and they were forced to close. In June, many of you probably have heard about this, the American Medical Collection Agency filed for bankruptcy after revealing an 8-month-long hack, which affected over 21 companies, some of whom we are very familiar with, Quest Diagnostics, LabCorp, all of those. So that affected, at the time, it was 24.4 million patients, but they keep coming out with more. And the AMCA alone spent $3.8 million just mailing notices, which is why you can see that led to their bankruptcy, that and that most of their clients quit working with them. In June, our own Premier Family Medical here in Utah, some of you may be on here, they had to notify patients of their own ransomware attack, which temporarily blocked access to certain systems. Luckily, they had good things in place and were able to rebuild from that, and nothing more serious happened from that. But we can see that no one is safe. We're not safe here in happy little Utah or wherever we might be. In August. And I like this example because it points out the risks that are out there. A single employee's email account was compromised for just a few hours, but that breach was for 2,890 patients simply because there was a waitlist spreadsheet in one of that employee's emails. So it's good to be aware of the types of things that we are emailing, the types of things that we are leaving in our email. So email management is an important thing to pay attention to when we are considering how do we protect ourselves against data breaches. A few other examples. In August also, the University of Alabama notified patients of a breach due to, again, access of employee email accounts. It was done through a phishing scam that looked like a business survey coming from one of their executives. Many of us have seen many of us have sent these kind of surveys actually from our own offices, our own executives. Some of us have received them, or some of us have received phishing or hacking emails that look like they're coming from one of the executives. One time I actually got one when I was standing there next to the owner of our company, and I was like, why did you just send me an email? But it wasn't from him. It was a phishing email. So helping make sure people are aware of what those can look like, because they can look very authentic. Wood Ranch Medical in California, they were hit with ransomware and their servers were encrypted, and unfortunately their backup hard drives were also encrypted. They were unable to rebuild because of that, and they actually closed their practice in December. In November, the Health Share of Oregon had to notify over 650,000 patients due to a break and theft of a laptop at its transportation vendor. And it's important to recognize as we talk through this that third-party vendors represent up to 20% of data breaches. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can protect ourselves there. And then so far in January 2020, there were 1.03 breaches per day that were reported to the Office of Civil Rights, which is where these HIPAA breaches are required to be reported. And then just in March 2020, this is the one that we were talking about, that there were at least 2 separate phishing campaigns that were impersonating the WHO. And on there, they offered an ebook that was claiming to contain coronavirus research and guidance how to protect your business and your children from infection, as well as potential cures. So that's kind of what these things can look like. It's important to recognize as well that with many of these the malware and the ransomware attacks, the threat actors, the hackers, have taken to naming victims publicly and dumping the data publicly as well if the owners refuse to pay. There were also incidents in 2019 where the hackers actually directly went to patients and tried to extort money directly from them. So they were not just going after the healthcare providers or the groups that they had attacked, they were actually going straight to the patients as well. So just a reminder that the risks are not decreasing. Most of them we're familiar with, and there are ways to address them, but we do need to be aware of what's out there so that we act and make good business decisions as we work through them. So let's talk. The other thing that I wanted to bring out is the private litigation. This is related to these breaches, but it's interesting because HIPAA does not have a private right of action. So patients cannot sue under a HIPAA breach. However, they're finding ways and reasons to sue otherwise. So some examples of that: in March of last year, a patient filed a class action lawsuit against the University of Connecticut, alleging that it had failed to safeguard the protected health information and that it had provided insufficient notice to the affected individuals when they experienced a breach. There's also in August of 2019, so less than a week after being notified of a potential breach, which we're all required to do under HIPAA, the patients filed a class action lawsuit against the University of Missouri Healthcare, arguing that it had put the victims at greater risk of identity theft. And typically, sometimes there are state laws that allow for a private right of action, and we'll talk a little bit more about what some of those are later. So sometimes they're filing under that. Sometimes they're filing under harm or negligence, different types of laws and regulations that are available to them. And this is new, actually. This really has started coming up much more recently and much more commonly in the last year or so. In November of last year, a patient filed suit against Kalispell Regional Healthcare underneath their Healthcare Information Act because they stated that Kalispell Regional had failed to implement the necessary security measures after Kalispell had reported and notified patients of a 3-month phishing attack. And then just in December, 4 patients filed suit against the DCH health system in Alabama following their notification of an October ransomware attack because they were alleging patient harm and HIPAA violations. Sometimes this will come up, the patients will file suit because they were unable to receive medical care, because often these health systems get shut down, even for a short period of time, as they try to make sure that their systems come back on, and they want to make sure that everything is in place and so they'll, close down for not required, non-essential healthcare. They'll still take emergency patients or things like that, but they won't be able to provide some of the other ones. The patients are sometimes alleging patient harm because they didn't have access to their records, or they're just finding all sorts of new ways to bring private litigation, civil lawsuits, in addition to any kind of perhaps HIPAA investigations that will come from reporting the breach. So it's good to be aware that these things are, I mean, this is why it's important to, as well, to remember that we are notifying our patients as quickly as possible when there is an incident, that we are communicating with them regularly, especially before an incident, about our efforts to protect their information. Sometimes they get annoyed because of all the different hoops they have to jump through, and I find it very helpful to just remind them why we do that. We're doing this for their own protection, and we're doing this because it's required by the law, and we want to make sure that their information is safe and that their healthcare information is available so we can provide the best care possible. So the threats that are out there typically that are leading to these kinds of data breaches, we see a lot of ransomware. We've talked about phishing. One of the reasons why that is a risk for so many of us is because many of us are working off of legacy software. We've recently, everybody had to upgrade to Windows 10 recently, things like that aren't even healthcare software, but we have so many different kinds of software in our practices and in our offices that it's hard to keep track sometimes of. And so you want to make sure, number one, that your IT team has all kinds of updates turned on, but also that you are watching for when things are going out of date. If your software is getting older, are there vulnerabilities there that can be addressed, or is it time for an upgrade or a change? And is it worth that cost simply because the risks and the vulnerabilities that exist? Obviously, we're all have to consider the budget constraints, right? We need to make sure that we are providing the best care for our patients, and that's the highest priority. And then how do we allocate the remaining budget available to us in, we have staff salaries, we have supplies, and right now this is especially the case for so many of us, but it may be a good time now if things are a little quieter around some of our offices. It may be a time to look at these things and start planning for the future when our budget constraints may be better, hopefully. As I mentioned, third-party vendors are an area to be aware of. They can sometimes be your best friend. They may actually be protecting you better than you would protect yourself. Other times they can be the ones that put you at risk. We'll talk a little bit about what we want to do to make the things that you should be asking them and the information that you're going to want from your third-party vendors to make sure that they are protecting the information that you are sharing with them in the same way that you would, or better, and how they can help you to address some of these threats. Loss and theft of information. Loss and theft typically is going to be of devices. That's when you're going to find it, and that's where most of these breaches some of the breaches that I highlighted, that's what happened. Mostly mobile devices, but sometimes we have heard of ones where actual provider offices get broken into, and computers are walked out, desktop computers sometimes. But typically that's going to be your mobile devices, and we're going to want to know how to address those and make sure that those are protected and encrypted in the ways that will protect us even in the case that might happen. And then, which really is in many ways something that happens, is employees make mistakes, right? We're all human. Each one of us is going to make mistakes. And so each person on our team has the opportunity to make sure that things work perfectly or make sure that things are going right. And they're also available to make those mistakes. Each one of us is going to do that. So we have to be aware of that and do all that we can to make sure that they know what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to avoid these threats and these risks, and what to do if they find out that something has happened. So some of the main things that you're going to want to have in place for this is you're going to want to make sure that you are conducting a risk assessment. This should actually be done annually if you haven't done it before. But this is really just a way of walking through both the digital and the physical, all of your practice, and saying, where are the risks and what kind of a risk is it? So for example, do we have locks on our doors? Well, yes. Okay, good. So that is a risk that you have addressed, right? Nobody's just going to walk into the office at night after you've left for the day. Do we have locks on our filing cabinets? Do we have locks on certain rooms? Do we have effective, strong passwords on our computers? Are things encrypted? These are the kinds of things you're going to walk through. It doesn't necessarily have to be an in-depth penetration test by a third party, though those are a good idea. But your first step is just to say, where are we at risk? Where could someone get to our information? Then following that, or even as you're doing it, you're going to want to make sure that you have good, effective policies in place. Anything that you've identified, you're going to want to try to address through a policy. Again, this may be a good time to revisit some of your policies if they need updating, if you have people that are perhaps not don't have enough work to do right now, maybe this is a good time to put them to work looking at some of those. Hopefully that won't be for much longer. Also, then you want to implement the solutions that you have identified as you went through your risk assessment, whether those are software solutions, again, they can be physical solutions. And then the main thing is training your staff. I can't emphasize this enough, because honestly, our staff is the first line of defense and often the last line of defense. They are the ones that are really, they are dealing with it all the time. They're the ones accessing the information. They're the ones working with the paper. They're the ones working with our patients. When they understand, again, for the last point, that you model and encourage a culture of compliance, when everyone on your team understands that this is the way that we operate, that legal and compliance is, don't get compromised, that we do what we're supposed to because it's the best thing for the patient and it protects us and our patients in a wide variety of ways, then your staff will be able to protect you and be less of a risk. But because as people, as human beings, we always kind of insert a little bit of risk just because of human nature. Let's talk a little bit about some specific strategies that you may want to implement. Again, this is cybersecurity strategies to protect that electronic protected health information. Some of these are basic and often can be quite inexpensive. Some of them are a little more in depth. So you're just can look at each one and say which ones can we do and which ones are the most practical and which ones are the most necessary based on the risk that we assign to the various solutions that we may be working in. So you'll want to have antivirus and anti-spyware, anti-malware, and firewalls set up on every single computer and computer system. You're going to want to look at how is that working and how is that affected, again, by those internet connected devices. Make sure that they do not introduce an opening into your larger computer system. You'll want to have email filters and internet filters in place. Again, email filters, most of the major email providers will have those kinds of things available to you, and they're very good at filtering out a lot of phishing and spam. They're not 100%, but they are going to get rid of quite a bit of it. So that's a very easy and basic way that you can just kind of work with them to make sure those are turned on. Same thing with your internet provider, or you may want to introduce some filters or programming, other software programs to help filter out, one, that your employees cannot go to sites that may have malware, may be introducing malware into your system. It helps obviously to help people working too if they're not out on YouTube or things like that. So internet filters have, and most of the things that we find with these compliance and security strategies, most of the time they have very good business benefits as well as the security and the compliance benefits. As I mentioned before, make sure that you have all your software updates turned on and actively updating, that they are happening. You'll want to have your IT people or whoever is in charge of that making sure that those updates are actually happening. They're not getting turned off accidentally by employees or not finishing for some reason, power went out, who knows, things can happen. Privileged access policies is simply making sure that people only have access to the information they need to have access to. So you're going to have levels of access depending on the responsibilities of each staff member. They have, so do they need to have access to every single chart note? Yes, great, give it to them. We want people to be functional. We want them to be able to get their work done. But if they don't need that access in order to get their work done, then they shouldn't have that access because it's not necessary. It goes with the whole HIPAA minimum necessary rule, right? Multi-factor authentication, turn that on for any program that allows it wherever you can. Trust me, we all know this can be a little bit annoying, but it is a very simple way to protect your systems, just to make sure that the person who is accessing it is who they say they are. Make sure that your backups, that you have backups. First of all, make sure you have backups, obviously, and then make sure that they are stored off-site or at the very least separate from your other computer systems. So again, we don't have that issue where we saw with the Woodside, where their backups were encrypted at the same time as everything else, and they were just kind of stuck. Backups are going to be your best friend if you are hit with ransomware. They can save you in so many ways. Plus, they're helpful sometimes just if you need to go back for any other reason. Some of the more in-depth things that you may find: intrusion detection systems and the active defense and deception technology. Those are a little more IT specific, and you may want to speak with your specialists there. Not everybody has them, but they are great. The ways that they're identifying when someone is trying to get into your system or when they have, they're more likely to catch it more quickly, rather than we have, for example, with the AMCA, where they had 8 months where someone was playing around in their system and nobody noticed. Which is, they're good at that, and it's very possible to happen. So the more that you can put in place to catch that, the better. And then ultimately it's disaster recovery planning, which helps, obviously, for example, if you had ransomware or anything like that, but some of us have had to use that here in the last couple of months, right? We've had to implement different types of policies and procedures and working situations simply because the standard wasn't available to us anymore. People had to work from home, they had to work remotely. How does that work? And we've had to put a lot of that in place. So many of us have, if we didn't have a good disaster or business continuity plan in place, we've kind of been developing one over the last couple of months. So let's write down what we've learned and make sure that we have that for the future. Should anything else happen, hopefully not this again, but you just never know, right? Okay, I mentioned again how important it is to train your staff. When I say you are the weakest link, I mean each one of us is the weakest link. Honestly, you can have every single one of those previous cybersecurity solutions in place, and a single person can break it through answering a phishing email or anything like that. So here's a couple of things that you want to make sure that you are training your staff on a regular basis, so they know what the policies and procedures are and what the rules are for your practice. Train them to always verify email addresses and fax numbers before sending anything. If you allow email, make sure that it's encrypted. Never send PHI across the internet unencrypted. Patients can ask for that, and if they ask for that and you allow it, then you probably could. We discourage it as much as possible, but if a patient requests it and approves it, then you can. Otherwise, they should never be sending PHI unencrypted. You want to make sure when they're going to fax numbers or anywhere else that they're going to the right place. Same with physical addresses if you're mailing statements or anything else. You want to encrypt and password protect all remote devices, and ideally your desktop devices, anything that, even if they're not as remote, but especially those remote or those mobile devices, need to be encrypted and password protected. So if that's not in place with your people that are working remotely, make sure that you have as much as possible, that they have very strong passwords. We'll go over what those can look like, and that you're encrypting them with whatever you have available to you. And then make sure that your employees know how about reporting those potential issues. If they see something, what should they do about it? Or if they do something, what should they do about it? So they need to be trained on how to recognize the issues. We're going to go into a little bit on how to recognize and stop those phishing emails. How do they report? Who do they report to? How do they report? Is it online? Is it through a hotline? Do they talk to someone? What are their options for reporting? You need to make sure that confidential and anonymous reporting is available to them, so that they are, because as I say, I would rather you told me and I could do something about it, because I can't fix something I don't know about. So it's important that that's why this very last bullet is so important in your offices, that they understand that there is a non-negotiable non-retribution and non-retaliation policy in place, that you would rather know about the problem and fix it. You're not going to try and blame someone or fire someone because they were the problem, they made the mistake, or because they told you about it. You want your staff members to feel comfortable coming to you with questions, raising the issues, because again, they're on the front lines. They're working it all day, every day. You don't see what they see. There's no way that you can. You only see what you see. And so you can report on your things, but you want everybody on your team to be part of that team, that you want them to be part of your compliance task force, identifying potential issues and sharing them with you and with anybody else that can do something about it. So again, these are the ways to have a good password policy. Most of these we know, but make sure that everyone has their own user IDs and passwords. There should not be sharing of any user IDs and passwords in your office. That's, again, just a great vulnerability, because then somebody leaves and it doesn't get changed, and then like 10 million people know your password. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but there's a lot. Again, and I usually share this because this is good for all of us in our day-to-day life as well as in our practices. A strong password is at least 8 characters. They recommend 15 or even longer. I encourage our employees to use passphrases. So it's like a sentence. So it's lots of characters, but it's easier to remember for them, and they can find ways to do it. In those passwords, you would want to have a mixture of upper and lowercase letters, also a mixture of letters and numbers, and at least one special character, if not more. Apparently some websites don't like the lesser than, greater than, so maybe not those, although I've seen those in passwords and they can work. But especially as you're mixing those in, they should be mixed in a little bit randomly. I am guilty always of using 1 for I or 3 for E. Those are kind of the standards, but if you can mix them in an upper and a lowercase or a number in ways or in places that would be somewhat unexpected, that's going to strengthen that password. Passwords should be changed every 90 days, whether or not your system requires it. It's a good idea. And then make sure that your employees understand they should not reuse passwords across platforms or even time to time when they do change them every 90 days. Because if their password is the same on every single platform that they use, then the hacker only needs to figure out one password and they have access to lots of other things. So that's good for all of us, for our bank accounts, our email accounts, personal and at work, but especially across these platforms where we may have scheduling software, we may have electronic health record, we may have practice management software, we may have, again, those Internet of Things, those medical devices, all those different things we want to use strong, not too complicated to remember. There's ways to remember them, but make sure that they're strong and that they're not being reused. Again, here's a way, again, to train your people how to recognize phishing and what to do with it. Often it's email or social media or text coming from a known sender. So it's something they're expecting to get. Sometimes they're not expecting to get it, but it is from someone they know. Typically it will ask the recipient to do something. It'll ask them to send money, buy gift cards, again, enter their login credentials, go to a web page, download something. Those are the types of things, which again, lots of legitimate emails do that as well. But when they're, but especially the ones where they're sending money, buying gift cards, anything like that, this next slide tells you what you should double check before you do any of that. Double check the email address that it's coming from. They're very good at making it look legitimate, but if you look for more than just 1 second, typically you can see that it's not google.com, it's google@somedomain.com or apple@somedomain.com. Again, if you glance too quickly, it's easy to miss, but if you look for more than a second or two, most of the time you can see that that email address is not legitimate. A lot of us also have those little warnings set up where it says this email came from outside of the organization. That's a good way to recognize it as well if it's coming from supposedly an executive in your company. The other thing you can do is go out and then check the Facebook profile or Google the phone number or the email or the website that they've got in that email or in that text or social media message. Go out and see if it's a legitimate company, if it's really the one that you want to deal with. Another good way to do it is to make sure that they follow up with the sender separately, which is what I do most of the time. I say, did you actually send me an email asking me for this? And sometimes yes, and sometimes no, but at least then we know for sure. It's easy also, they can hover over a link to check where the URL is actually taking them. Because this is a big one where they get people is you click on a link, it takes you somewhere, you log in, and you've just given someone your login information. So they recommend never logging in from a link, go directly to the website rather than from a link in one of your emails and log in from there. But again, you can hover over the link, and if it looks like the correct link, it's the correct company and all of that, then you could probably go ahead with that. This is the kind of training that you're going to want to provide to your staff to make sure that they, and as often as possible, several times a year at a minimum, just say kind of reminders like, hey, this is what a strong password looks like. Make sure you're not sharing your passwords. Have you changed your passwords lately? This is what a phishing email can look like. This is how to recognize them. And again, these warnings, for example, from the CDC and the WHO, making people aware that that is happening, it usually makes sure that for at least a little while till we all get comfortable again, they may catch those more easily and be less likely to click on them and open your systems up to ransomware or other kind of malware. Let's talk a little bit what we have learned from HIPAA enforcement after the last year or so. So security breaches are a HIPAA breach typically, but obviously the risks and the costs of them go far beyond what happens just under HIPAA, although that is major. HIPAA enforcement over the last few years, these are some of the lessons that we have learned. This is what they are doing now. They are moving away from an education standpoint where they used to, when they found out there had been a breach, they tried to educate the providers, the covered entities on what the problem was and to help them fix it. They're moving away from that into stronger enforcement because they feel like, okay, everybody's had enough time now to understand HIPAA and should be following it, I guess. So what we are seeing is that smaller breaches are under closer scrutiny. So what they're watching for is for multiple small breaches and seeing if they represent a pattern of non-compliance. So, because a lot of us have breaches, minor breaches, typically 1 or 2 patients, where maybe a statement was sent to the wrong address or something was sent somewhere, things like that that just kind of happen because of some transposed number, things like that. But they're going to be looking for, because they're not only looking at the ones 500 and above, they're looking at the smaller ones. And these are the things that they're going to, when they focus on that, they're going to focus on, does it look like this covered entity has done a routine security risk assessment like we talked about before? Are they doing those risk assessments, and are they doing something about them? Do they have policies and procedures? Do they have them, and do they follow them? That's kind of the other main point. You want to make sure that not only do you have those good policies and procedures in place saying how we comply with all of these things and how we protect this information and protect our patients and avoid fraud, but do we actually follow the policies that we keep in place? Another one they're going to want to look at is, do you have valid business associate agreements in place with your vendors? Or if you are a vendor, are there valid business associate agreements in place with your clients, with the covered entities? Those are there to make sure that if the breach is being caused by one of those third-party vendors, was there appropriate understanding between those two groups of who was responsible for what and what was expected? Again, we talked about routine employee training. You need to make sure that your employees, they are watching to make sure that you are training your employees. That is one very obvious and relatively easy way, because it can be just an email or a newsletter or something posted in your office, but a relatively easy way to prove that you were committed to compliance and that you were trying. Although things didn't work maybe perfectly, something happened, there was a breach, but that is very good proof that you really were trying. So that's another good reason to do your employee training. Patients' right of access is one that they're really watching lately, and that is when patients are asking for access to or copies of their medical records. Is that being given to them in a timely manner according to the HIPAA regulations? This is one that the administration recently has focused on in the last year or two, and they've started prosecuting covered entities when they feel like a patient's right of access has been violated. And then also they are looking at social media policies. Social media has opened this whole new area of risk for some of us. It's great in so many ways. We're able to communicate with our patients. We're able to do some marketing and advertising. We can get good reviews, which helps invite other patients to come in and see us. But the way that we manage that, we need to make sure that we are not breaching or violating HIPAA in the ways that we are using our social media, especially if we're responding to posts from patients or their representatives. And we'll have some examples of how that can work. So the other things that we need to make sure is those documented risk mitigation plans must be followed. If we're doing a risk assessment and we've identified risks, are we doing something about it? It may be incremental. We may be doing little by little according to what we can afford and what we have time to do and what is reasonable for us, but are we doing it? We don't want to have a risk mitigation plan that everybody's ignoring. That is a different kind of risk. They are watching to make sure that patient health information must be secured, which in the Office of Inspector Generals and the Office of Civil Rights, they consider that to be encrypted. Are things being encrypted? Even though HIPAA does not, there's no direct regulatory requirement to encrypt data, that is what they're looking at. In their mind, basically, there's not really any reason not to encrypt data, especially if you're sending it places. But you would have to have, you can document that again because it's not a regulatory requirement, but they're basically saying there's not really an exception to that. Another thing that we've learned from their enforcement over the last year or two is that PHI does not need to be seen by someone to be disclosed. A lot of this stems from ransomware, where they are stating that ransomware is a presumed breach. They assume that it's been breached even if there's no proof necessarily that the information was disclosed or exfiltrated by the hackers. And mostly that's just them saying that if you have one, you need to report it. They want that reported so it can be looked at. They don't want people saying, oh, it's fine, I don't need to report this under HIPAA because we're pretty sure they didn't see anything. They just locked it all up. But they're saying basically they consider that a breach and it needs to be reported. And finally, the one thing that they really focus on is that employers are responsible for employees that do not follow policies, meaning that if you had a bad actor for some reason and an employee did something egregious, they would not only go after the employee, but that's where you would want to have that really good documentation that how thoroughly you're training your employees, and you would want to have good documentation that you were enforcing the policies and regulations that you have in place, and that you were sanctioning is the word that they use, or discipline or training for employees that do violate the policies. That's going to be your best defense in that area, to just prove that, look, I tell them all the time what they're supposed to do. I tell them how to report when there's an issue. When there's an issue, I address it quickly, and I provide retraining, or I write them up with a warning if necessary, again, if it looks like they were doing it intentionally, whatever those policies might be. If you have those in place and you can show that you were doing that consistently, that's going to be your best protection. If you did have an employee who, especially on purpose, but even those who may be on accident, cause some kind of significant breach or HIPAA violation, you would be able to you would be able to prove that they should have known and that you did all that you could have. So just some examples of the types of fines that we have seen in the last year or so. So just in March, a Utah provider paid $100,000 for failure to complete an accurate and thorough risk analysis and to implement sufficient security measures. So again, had a breach, probably more than one, they got reported, and in their investigation of it, what they found is that the risk analysis probably wasn't really done, and that what they knew they should have done, such as maybe encryption or that employee training, things like that, also was not done. So they had to pay a fine or a settlement to close that investigation. In December, an ambulance company in Georgia also paid $65,000 again for the failure to conduct a risk analysis, to provide security awareness and training to their employees, and to implement those HIPAA policies and procedures. So if you know it's supposed to be done, it's best to try and get it done, or at least show that you're working towards it. Also in December, Corunda Medical had to pay $85,000 because they failed to forward a patient's medical records in the electronic format that had been requested. So, and they were charging the patient more than they were allowed to charge under the HIPAA regulations. So this is one of those examples of the administration's crackdown on the failure to provide patient access under HIPAA. And then again, here's one of those on social media. This was a dental provider, but they had to pay $10,000 because they responded to a patient's complaint on social media. So if you are following social media posts and your patients are posting things and you are seeing things that you feel like you need to respond to, you need to probably get legal advice on how best to do that, because you almost can't even acknowledge that they were a patient. Because that opens you for a risk of, we have to follow, the patients can say anything they want. They're not obligated under HIPAA, but the rest of us are. So we cannot necessarily respond in that way. And then just a couple of other areas to be aware of. These are kind of the same things, but again, it's device management is what you'll see here. They didn't encrypt their devices, and the devices kept getting stolen. So having multiple breaches for kind of the same thing that is kind of an obvious part of HIPAA is where you're going to maybe put yourself at risk. Most of us, I don't think, are doing that, but it happens. So again, these are the ways to avoid enforcement. Conduct your risk analysis like we've talked about. Make sure you have your written policies and procedures. Make sure that you are encrypting devices, especially those mobile devices that you may be using. Again, train your staff. Make sure they know what the patient rights are under HIPAA, and they know your process for meeting those obligations under HIPAA. Make sure they're verifying patient information every time that patient comes into your office. That way you know that you have the correct physical address, the correct email address, the correct cell phone number if you're texting them, all of those things, that you have less risk of that going to the wrong place or the wrong person. Encrypt all communication containing PHI, and make sure that you're maintaining confidentiality within your office as well as when you disclose it beyond its walls. And then finally, make sure that your business associate agreements are in place, and that your business associates have done all of these same things. All those cybersecurity things that we talked about, all of these things, make sure that your business associates are doing the same thing, and talk to them about it. Most of them, you should be able to tell by the way that they communicate and the way that their staff communicates with you and your patients, but it's always good to double check. Finally, to wrap it up, we'll go into fraud, which is outside of HIPAA. It's usually under the False Claims Act, or also Stark and anti-kickback regulations. So the main things are that under False Claims Act, you cannot knowingly submit a false claim for payment to the federal government. You can't ignore a false claim once it has been discovered. So if you figure out something went out that was wrong, you need to fix it. And then you have to report that and repay it within 60 days of discovery. So whether or not you find that a refund is owed because actually the wrong payer paid, or you billed for something that you ended up not actually performing, things like that. Those are the ways that you need to report on those. The penalties under the False Claims Act usually includes repayment plus interest. So you obviously have to refund whatever money you may have been paid under an alleged false claim. Then there are also the civil monetary penalties. So they range from anywhere about $11,000 to $23,000 per claim. That depends on the circumstances of the false claim. Was it intentional? Was it accidental? Did you have things in place? Did you fix it immediately? All of those things. And these numbers change. They go up with inflation, so they change every year. They will also go after you for treble damages, so 3 times whatever they may have paid you or whatever you may have billed is what they will go after. And then they can also exclude providers from Medicare or Medicaid or any other government programs, so that for periods up to 20 years at this time, where you would not be able to refer, treat, do orders, anything for patients with any of those federally funded programs. And ultimately, prison time is a risk. Hopefully that's not one most of us deal with, but it is one of the possibilities under the False Claims Act, as well as under Stark and anti-kickback. So just to touch on those briefly, the Stark law, which is the physician self-referral law, it limits physician referrals when there's a financial connection with the entity. So basically, if your practice owns an imaging center, then you need to make sure that that's set up appropriately under legal safe harbors, so you're not referring to yourself. That's what they're trying to get. So again, they're trying to decrease financial incentives for care referrals. They want to make sure that the referrals are based on the best care for the patient, the thing that's best for the patient, not on where the money might come from. Same thing for the anti-kickback law, which prohibits asking for or receiving anything of value to induce or reward referrals of healthcare, of federal healthcare program business. So that's something like if a supplier is offering free supplies, that could implicate the anti-kickback law. For your pharmaceutical companies, you want to look at the way that the things you've got arranged and set up with them. A lot of this has changed over the recent years because of these types of things. We'll have an example later of one example of how this could be violated. And then just in September, the program integrity rules for CMS, so Medicare and Medicaid, has implemented new provider enrollment rules where they're watching for affiliations, where if a provider in your office or if your group has an owner or other affiliations with people that have previously been kept from participating in the program or who shouldn't be participating in the program, then they're going to either go back and remove your participation or they won't approve it if you have it. So they're increasing their observation of these enrollment authorities and how they're enforcing those. So again, the things that they look for, these are examples of what they consider fraud: billing for procedures that are not performed, taking or offering kickbacks or other payments in exchange for referrals, upcoding or even downcoding they will look at. So billing for equipment or procedures that were more expensive or more extensive than what the patient actually needed or than what was provided. And then obviously your documentation, if it's based on inadequate or forged medical records. They look at billing under another healthcare provider's name or number, as that's when they watch very closely. Modifiers, we've all had lots of edits and rejections on claims because of that. Then also the routine waiver of copayment and billing insurance only, that's considered an incentive to the patients to come and receive healthcare from you, unless it's based on financial hardship. Those are okay, but otherwise, or COVID-19, obviously. Otherwise, you cannot have routine waiver. The failure to refund, and also the employment of excluded individuals. So some examples of the ways that these have come about. So this is one of those kind of anti-kickback examples. They had to agree to a settlement of $151,000 because they were receiving what they considered remuneration in the form of free point-of-care test cups from a lab. So it's something as simple as that we often don't even think about, but we need to look at those types of things that we may be receiving from groups that we refer business to or that we use as a vendor, and make sure that we're not coming across any of those anti-kickback or Stark laws. Same thing here with the spinal frontier. And then some examples here where this family practice in Texas they had a settlement of almost $54,000 because their medical coder, they discovered that their medical coder had been excluded from participating in federal healthcare programs. Which is very easy. It's easy to happen. We get people and we get them started because we're in a hurry and we may not always check to make sure that they haven't been excluded, or checking to make sure that they haven't been excluded since they started working for us. And then finally, the same one, this was the one that really killed me, is that he had 3 different false claim settlements before they actually excluded him for 3 years. So they are willing to work with you, but you need to make sure that you're doing your best to avoid medically unnecessary services, or that your documentation supports the medical necessity. So to wrap that up, the best ways to avoid committing fraud, again, very simple, usually not very complicated, OIG checks. Make sure that before you employ anyone, and usually monthly, but a minimum annually, you should be checking the OIG exclusion list to make sure that they haven't been excluded, because everything they touch, if they've been excluded, is considered a false claim. Your documentation make sure your documentation is good enough. Are you supporting the medical necessity for the actions that you are taking and the orders that you are making for your patients? And a good way to do that is through coding audits. Are you having a coding and documentation audit on a regular basis just to check? Are we really documenting what we need to make sure that it supports the codes that we are billing? Watch your provider contracts. That's one of the ways that they really can come into conflict with either Stark or anti-kickback, is if the provider contracts are based on reimbursement that may, again, incentivize them to either refer to a certain place, or to they're getting things for free, different things like that. Vendor contracts the same way. Then make sure that your provider enrollment is being done accurately. You are enrolling all providers and billing under their numbers. And that fits into that incident to billing, right? With our nurse practitioners and our physician's assistants, all of them, we want to make sure that we are billing them appropriately and correctly according to federal and the commercial payer guidelines, so that we don't run afoul of any kind of fraud that way. Finally, to wrap it up, this is just some of the regulation that is coming out recently. Privacy is a big one that most states are starting to address because the federal government has not yet. The CCPA in California is a big one. The SHIELD Act in New York is another one that they're starting to come across with, and we're starting to see more and more of those, and you'll want to watch your own local state legislatures. And be aware, especially if you do work in various states, be aware of what those are, because they're increasing as patients demand greater protection of their information. There are privacy proposals being discussed at a federal level. And then the biggest one really is the surprise billing. Most of us have heard about this. Is what often is called balance billing or surprise billing, when a patient goes to an in-network facility or who they think is an in-network provider, and then they get hit with out-of-network bills. And they're already starting to address this for those of us who have received monies out of the provider relief funds from the CARES Act. One of the requirements in accepting that is that you will not charge out-of-network rates to patients for COVID-19. So this is obviously high and a priority even at a federal level, and it's also been addressed here in Utah recently. That one didn't pass, but it will probably come up again because it's come up the last few years. So to be aware of these and the ways that your practices in your policies within your practice that you make sure that you are covering those. So here's some of your take-home points. It's worth investing in data security. Make sure you train your staff. Make sure that you have a culture of compliance, that everybody knows that it is important to you. Audit your documentation and your coding. Then check all your agreements and make sure you invest in your front desk. Your front desk is your front line. They're going to be the ones most likely to make sure that you have the correct information, and often that's the most available to people that can see information. So make sure that you've got strong, intelligent, and capable staff there in your front desk. And that wraps up the presentation. It went a little bit longer, but I'll back over to you, Sarah, for any questions that may have come up.
Thank you, Robin. It does look like we have a question, and just as a reminder, or for those who didn't hear at the beginning, you can submit your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom and center of your screen. Look for a chat bubble icon. Also, stick around to the end of the questions, because once we're done, we're going to be handing out a gift card, and we're going to be randomly choosing from the list of people who are still connected to the webinar at that time. So it should just be a few minutes out, but it looks like the first question is, Are there companies that you would recommend that can perform a risk assessment for a provider or billing office? Do you have resources around the risk assessment and what to make sure is being looked at?
There are multiple companies out there, and it really kind of depends on what you're looking for. There, we have some good local companies that provide these types of services. And if you wanted to reach out to me, hopefully, Sarah, you can maybe make my email available. I can get you, we can help you with something like that, but also there are companies that provide, some of them do mostly software. So you would kind of do your own risk assessment through their provided software, and then they would provide you support through that. Others will do it for you completely. Some are very cybersecurity focused. Others are more just kind of general HIPAA focused and helping you to make sure that you have that documentation in place. Um, and there's national ones as well. And it just kind of depends on what kind of service and support you're looking for. Are you looking for the entire thing being done for you? There are companies that do that. It tends to be pretty expensive. And then there's often hybrids type where you do some of it and they will help support you, and a variety of things like that.
Thank you for that. I don't see any other questions just yet. Let's give it just about half a minute to see if any more come through. And if they don't, we'll move on to the drawing. All right, I'm not seeing any more come through quite yet, so let's go ahead and give away that gift card. And this gift card, by the way, is a thank you to everybody who is coming. We were so disappointed that we couldn't hold the Provider Education Summits in person, and this is our way of helping to give you a little bit of that atmosphere virtually. I'm using a random number generator and then counting down the list of people who are still connected. And it looks like our winner for this afternoon is a JM, perhaps a McCraley. So we will be reaching out to you. We have your email from your registration, and we'll be reaching out to you to get that e-gift card over to you. So if anyone continues to have questions, we'll stick around here for just a minute. Go ahead and send those in. Otherwise, for everyone else, thank you so much for your attendance. We do have another webinar next week. It's going to be on Thursday the 7th at noon, Soft Skills Are the New Hard Skills, and Here's Why by Michael Page. So thank you for joining us today and hope to see you at a future webinar.